Chapter 19. Solving the Case. As the 4 Bledsoe County men sped away from the Gouge home that night, they threw out some unused fuses in yellow and red wrapping paper and a pair of rubber gloves as they crossed the tunnel bridge over the Doe River, a mile and a half from the Gouge home. They only slowed down and tossed the items out the window without stopping. Shortly after the blast, State Highway Patrolman Hugh Slate was called to the scene of the Gouge home. On his way, Slate kept a sharp eye on the highway for possible clues. As he crossed the Doe River, he sighted the bright fuse wrapping papers. When he stopped to investigate, the paper contained the name and address of the Agnew Hardware Company of Chattanooga. Deputy A.B. Williams was later dispatched to Chattanooga, where an employee recalled selling a large amount of dynamite fuse wrapped in paper identical with that found on the tunnel bridge. Even though he couldn't identify the person who made the purchase, this discovery became a very important piece of evidence for investigators. Still on their way back to Pikeville after setting the dynamite, the 4 men heard about the dynamite blast on the radio just before reaching Knoxville. They sped up, and the law pulled them over in Knoxville for speeding. White Miller explained to them he was a Bledsoe County coroner, and Lee and Ulysses were deputy sheriffs. The authorities let the 4 go on their way without issuing a ticket. Word of the tragedy spread quickly. Carter County Sheriff Moreland was on the scene in 30 minutes. The sheriff sent his deputies to Bramer to round up every Tollett and all of their friends who could be found in Carter County. May Tollett was arrested long before daylight. By midday, authorities had arrested and locked up May, Frank Thompson, Jim Greer, Clyde and Tom DeLoach, Bruce Pierce, and Ori Lawson. The last 5 were good friends of the Tolletts. Moreland questioned each of the 7, and each denied any knowledge whatsoever of the crime. As Sheriff Moreland was concluding his questioning of Tollett, relatives and friends, early Friday morning, Deputy Paul Heaton rushed into his office. Heaton said local resident Tom DeFries had come to him and reported he was driving home very early Friday morning from Bristol when he saw a car with a Bledsoe County license tag cruising slowly near Lotus Avenue. He was almost positive the driver was Lee Walker. After hearing this, the sheriff immediately grabbed the phone and asked the operator to connect him with the sheriff in Pikeville. One of Sheriff Walling's deputies or the jailer answered the phone and told Moreland that Walling was out. As Moreland started to tell the deputy what had happened, the deputy butted in and said, "Yeah, we know all about it." Moreland was stunned that the news had already reached Pikeville, as it was only getting daylight. A little later, Moreland did get Sheriff Walter Walling on the phone and asked that he arrest Craven White Miller Tollett and Lee Walker. Walter told Crave that they could not have been in Hampton last night because he was talking to him before daylight that morning. Moreland wondered why Walling was talking to Crave before daylight, and became very suspicious of the relationship between the Bledsoe County Sheriff and Crave. Moreland later discovered May had called Crave from the jail earlier that morning to report the bombing. Around 6:30 or 7 o'clock Friday, as the sun peeked its head over Walden's Ridge, White Miller, Church, Lee, and Ulysses arrived back at the home of John Ebbett in the head of the Sequatchie Valley. Crave had already been to the Ebbett home and told John and Betsy that May had called and informed him that the 3 Gouge girls had been killed. Church, White Miller, and Lee stayed 10 to 15 minutes and had a little breakfast. Ulysses didn't eat and said he had to leave. The other 3 jumped into White Miller's car, which was evidently parked at the Ebbett home and nearby at his parents' home, and they drove toward Pikeville. They let Church out on East Valley Road at the foot of Clark Gap, and he walked home from there. They stopped at Carl Brown's house and picked him up. Then they met Crave on the road before they arrived in Pikeville, and Crave stopped them. White Miller and Ulysses went back to Crave's car and talked for a long while. Then, while Carl stayed in the car, Crave told them that he, White Miller, and Lee were wanted in Elizabethton. Carl was let off in Pikeville to help Dallas Talley unload a truckload of lumber. Crave, White Miller, Lee, and Ulysses drove down to the jail and saw Sheriff Walter Walling about 8 o'clock Friday morning. Sheriff Walling grinned and told them that he had to arrest White Miller and Lee, but he did not arrest them at the time. They arranged to go to Walter's home at the top of Walden's Ridge on Route 30 later that morning. Then Crave, White Miller, and Lee went to the Toilet restaurant and had a drink of liquor. As prearranged, they drove to Walter's home on the mountain where they built a fire, had a drink of whiskey, and talked with the sheriff. Possible alibis were discussed. Walling again told that he had to arrest White Miller and Lee. When the authorities in Elizabethton later asked Lee if the sheriff inquired as to where they had been the previous night, Lee quoted Walter Walling as stating, "You boys know where you were. I'm not going to ask you." All four men then proceeded to drive back to Pikeville, where they spent some time at the Toilet restaurant. Most of their time was spent with Johnny Vaughn, Walter Ferguson, Wade Farmer, John Evatt, Tom Taylor, Ulysses Walling, and Sheriff Walling at the jail, but not in a cell behind bars. They were busy arranging bond for the men charged and discussed and planned their alibis there at the jail. During their discussion, Vaughn, a Chevrolet car dealer at Pikeville, asked Lee, "Do you know where you were last night?" When Lee said no, Vaughn, who had a room at the Pikeville boardhouse, said, "You were up in my room. I woke you up about 4 o'clock. Carter County deputies Paul Heaton and Claude Meredith arrived around dark Friday evening to take White Miller and Lee to the Carter County Jail in Elizabethton. Evidently, Crave was not around at that time when the deputies came. Sheriff Walling told Sheriff Moreland he would bring Crave up later. Early Saturday morning, Special Investigator for the National Board of Fire Insurance Underwriters Harry S. Avery and Deputy State Fire Marshal Virgil M. Kitts arrived at Sheriff Moreland's office in Elizabethton. Avery was a tall, slender, quiet person who dressed like a successful businessman. His appearance was deceiving because, in reality, Avery was a well-earned national reputation as a famous detective. Avery graduated from law school and practiced law for 3 years before taking this job as a special investigator 10 years earlier. In his low-key, persistent, and methodical manner, he was excellent at knowing what questions to ask and how to get to the bottom of a case, Kitts assisted. Avery added most of the questions, and Kitts kept good notes. Sheriff Moreland and many others did yeoman work on solving these murders, and Avery was given the most credit for cracking the case. Tennessee Governor Gordon Browning and the Carter County Commission had offered a $2,500 reward for information on leading to the conviction of the perpetrators. A notice of this award was posted in the Pikeville post office. After the trial, Avery refused to accept any of the $2,500 reward he was offered for his huge contribution in solving the crime. Avery and Kitts went to the scene of the dynamited gouge home after talking with the sheriff and other authorities in Carter County. They examined the debris and the basement window through which the fuse traveled. They questioned Fletcher Gouge and searched the area around the home. From there, they drove to Elizabethton, to the jail, and interviewed White Miller Tollett and Lee Walker, who were in custody. White Miller and Lee said on the evening of the bombing that they had driven in the rain to the home of White Miller's girlfriend, Myrtle Ferguson, whose family lived between the Brayton and Hendon communities on Walden's Ridge, about 15 miles southeast of Pikeville. They said they saw Myrtle and her brother Walter. After leaving there, they said they returned to Pikeville to Johnny Vaughn's room 6 at the Greer Hotel, where all 3 men slept that night. After talking with White Miller and Lee, investigators Avery and Kitts drove as fast as they could to Pikeville Saturday afternoon. They noted the trip took 4 hours and 41 minutes, driving at a maximum speed of approximately 60 miles an hour. This was critical information. He established a timeline for the case. They did not go to the sheriff's office or to the police in Pikeville. Instead, Avery and Kitts drove to the Vaughn Ferguson home and talked to the mother of White Miller's girlfriend, Mrs. Ferguson was not certain it was Thursday evening when White Miller had come to visit her daughter. They drove back to Pikeville and questioned Greer Hotel manager Mrs. Isa G. Spence, who took them to Johnny Vaughn's room 6. These crack investigators noticed the small room was only 11 feet long and 10 feet wide and contained only a 3/4 size bed. They seriously doubted that 3 grown men would have slept in that one bed. Mrs. Spence told the detectives she did not believe the bed was slept in that night because the covers were not even turned down when she made up the room the following morning. Avery and Kitts then talked to Lee Walker's parents, who told them Lee did not come home on the night of the blast. They talked to Carl Brown, who told them that he did not know the men were making a trip to Hampton. On the evening before the blast, the 4 men dropped him off at his home on their way to the head of the valley. Carl told Avery and Kitts all he knew and became a key witness. After questioning him, they contacted and questioned every person Carl had mentioned. From there, they continued to question everyone that the other people mentioned. They talked to numerous others in Bledsoe County on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. This quick action by the 2 investigators was key to solving the case. Sheriff Moreland again telephoned Sheriff Walter Walling on Saturday and asked him to transport Crave Tollett to Elizabethton as a conspirator before the fact. Walter said he would do so on Sunday morning. When Crave did not arrive in Elizabethton by noon on Sunday, Moreland called Joe Boyd Williams, head of the Tennessee Highway Patrol in Nashville, and asked him to send his men to Bledsoe County to make the arrest. After Williams called Sheriff Walter Walling, he called Moreland back and assured him that Walter would cooperate and take Crave to him in Elizabethton. But the Bledsoe County Sheriff did not know. He did not show up in Carter County with Crave on Sunday, so late in the day, Moreland had a telephone conversation with Crave and his lawyer, Wade Farmer. Moreland agreed to let Farmer and Russell Swafford drive Crave to Elizabethton, while Sheriff Walling drove there in another car. All 4 drove to Elizabethton Sunday evening, but did not go to see Sheriff Moreland until just before daybreak Monday morning. When they arrived at the jail, Moreland immediately arrested Crave. He was confined to the jail without bond until the trial was over. Moreland also arrested Bledsoe County Sheriff Walling for being an accessory after the fact, assisting a person charged with murder and helping that person escape the law. Pikeville lawyer Wade Farmer stayed in Elizabethton to represent both Sheriff Walling and Crave. Moreland now had 4 Bledsoe County officials locked up in his jail: Sheriff Walling, Deputy Sheriff Crave Tollett and Lee Walker, and Coroner White Miller Tollett. Sheriff Walling stayed in jail for 3 days, from Monday until late Wednesday or early Thursday, and his bond was first set at $50,000, but later reduced to $5,000. His bond was completed in Pikeville on Wednesday night and taken to Elizabethton for his release. Walling later told that they kicked me around a lot while I was in the Elizabethton jail. Ori Cotton Lawson, a former employee of Arnold and Harmon Gouge's Bluebird Tavern business, was also taken to Elizabethton for questioning. A big break in the case came on Wednesday following the bombing on the previous Friday. Investigators Avery and Kitts and Sheriff Moreland were convinced that Lee Walker was not telling the truth and was the weakest link. His alibi contained more holes than a cribbage board. Lee's parents were good, honest Christian people who would not lie or give a false alibi. His parents told Avery and Kitts that Lee was not at home on the night of the blast. Sheriff Moreland had previously taken Lee to the funeral home and made him take a long look at the 3 little Gouge girls lying in their tiny caskets. Around 1 o'clock Wednesday afternoon, Moreland took Lee into the Governor Taylor Hotel, where they met Avery in the lobby. Avery suggested, "Let's have something to eat." Lee quickly agreed by saying, "Sure, that jail grub ain't the best." They proceeded to the dining room, where the investigators started sharing casually about the case. Avery, in his mild manner, discussed the discrepancies in Lee's story. Among many other points, Avery explained to Lee the details of their investigation, such as proving Lee didn't sleep in the hotel bed and did not haul logs for Lee Naramore the night of the blast, as Lee had claimed. After each item of proof, Avery, in his calm and smoothing voice, continued to tell Lee to tell the truth. After Lee was released from prison 12 years later, he was quoted as saying, "Avery knew more about the details of the operation than I knew myself." Lee did not know where or who bought the dynamite, the fuses, or the caps. He actually knew very little about the details of the plan. Avery and Sheriff Moreland grilled Lee nearly all of Wednesday afternoon, that night and early the next morning. Attorney General Grayson later joined them in their questioning. Early Thursday morning, Lee asked everyone in the room to leave except for Avery. Then Lee asked Avery, "Do you want to know all about this?" "There's only one thing. I don't want to go to the electric chair." Avery said he could not assure him about that, but the punishment should be lighter for one who played square and came clean. Lee broke down and started telling Avery the truth. Avery called Sheriff Moreland and Attorney General Grayson back to the cell, along with a public stenographer, and a full confession was recorded. Lee told the truth about everything involving both the dynamiting of the Gouge's car and the Gouge home. Prior to Lee's confession, the authorities had no knowledge of Ulysses Walling's involvement. After Lee confessed, 2 Carter County deputies traveled to Pikeville late Friday to pick up Ulysses and 4 Bledsoe County witnesses. These 4 key state witnesses were Carl Brown, Bill Walker, Dallas Talley, and Howard Evans. Evans decided to drive his own vehicle to Elizabethton, and the deputies transported the others. On their way back, the deputies picked up Ulysses in Crossville, where he was being held at the Highway Patrol office. All 7 arrived at the Elizabethton jail about 4 o'clock Saturday morning, January the 15th. Ulysses was made aware of Lee's confession. He confessed to his part of the crime within an hour and signed a written confession Saturday morning. His confession verified every detail of Lee's statement. Authorities did not release the news of either confession until late in the day Saturday. Also, prior to Lee's confession, police had no knowledge of Church Lester's involvement in the heinous crime. On Saturday, Church was eating dinner at George Henderson's when he heard of the radio there was a warrant for his arrest. Church came off the mountain to George Little's house and called the local authorities to give himself up. The press was told Church had surrendered to the Highway Patrol and was on his way to Elizabethton to be placed in jail. His expertise with dynamite was the main reason the Tollets took Church to Hampton with them. The detective on that case said he had never seen an expert dynamite job in his entire life. Saturday, January the 15th, was a big day. That morning, a preliminary hearing was held at the courthouse. The authorities kept the confession secret until after the hearing, at which time they reduced the full confession statements of both Lee Walker and Ulysses Walling to the multitude of press and the public. Newspaper and radio reporters scrambled to break the story to their readers and the listeners. Telephone lines were kept busy for hours. The news of the 2 confessions spread like wildfire all across Tennessee. Several newspapers published special afternoon editions. Thousands of mountain people crowded in the streets outside the jail, but there was no attempt to break in and apply mountain justice to these men charged. Charged against May Tollett, Frank Thompson, Clyde and Tom DeLoach, Bruce Pierce, and Ori Lawson were dismissed. These 6 had been out of jail since midweek on $10,000 bond each. It is understandable that sheriff would want to question these relatives and friends of the Tollets. However, there was not one bit of evidence that any of them were involved in any way with the dynamiting. In this day and time, the sheriff in the county would be sued and liable for millions of dollars for false imprisonment. But in the 30s, it was normal for a sheriff to arrest and place someone in jail who was only thought to have knowledge or involvement in a crime without any evidence to support that suspicion. Murder charges were placed against White Miller Tollett, Church Lester, Lee Walling, and Ulysses Walling. Crave Tollett was charged with accessory before the fact. Lawyers for these 5 men later argued that they could not get a fair trial in Carter County and petitioned the court for a change of venue. Their petition was denied. Myrtle Ferguson, her brother Walter Ferguson, and Johnny Vaughn were arrested and charged as accessories after the fact for helping the accused frame false alibis. These 3 were later released after each posted a $10,000 bond. Carl Brown said he and the other 3 Bledsoe County State witnesses, Bill Walker, Dallas Talley, and Howard Evans, were treated very well after they were taken to Elizabethton on Saturday, January the 15th. The first night they stayed in a big room in the jail and slept on cots. The next day, Carter County Deputy Paul Heaton took Carl with him to his room over the Doe River barbershop where Paul's brother Wendy worked as a barber. Carl lived with Paul for the entire 7 weeks he stayed in Elizabethton, until the end of the trial. The county paid for his room, board, and all of his expenses and treated him well. Carl said, "If you were a state witness, the people of Elizabethton treated you like a king. If you were a witness for the defense, you had better stay off the streets." Carl said several other people in Elizabethton toured him around the area. He often hung out at the barber shop, a gathering place for many locals. The other 3 state witnesses were housed in a local hotel, but they stayed in Elizabethton for only a few days. 1 or 2 days after Carl arrived in Elizabethton, Deputy Heaton brought Harmon Gouge into the room and introduced the 2 men. After that, Harmon often went to their room. One night, Harmon took Carl to Johnson City. Only the 2 of them went. Carl said Harmon got drunk, but he was careful to stay sober. Carl drove Harmon back to his house and helped him into the house where he was staying with his half-brother, K.P. Banks. "I was scared to death when he became drunk," Carl said. "If anything bad would have happened to Gouge while he was out with a man from Pikeville, I would have been in big trouble." Every time Carl saw Harmon, he was carrying a pistol in a holster on his hip. The gun was hidden by a coat that he wore over the holster. Carl told Harmon that he was related to the Tolletts. Carl's mother, Ruth Tollett Brown, was a first cousin to Arnold, Crave, and White Miller. In other words, Harmon had killed Carl's first cousin once removed. Harmon told hundreds of local people had come to him and said, "Let's take the 5 charged with the murder out of the jail and hang them." But Harmon told them, "No, let's let the law take care of them this time." Harmon told Carl he really regretted having to kill Arnold because Arnold was his friend. Harmon told Carl it was either kill Arnold or be killed by Arnold. There were tears in his eyes when he was nearly crying when he told about having to kill Arnold. Carl really believed Harmon was telling the truth. Harmon's half-brother, K.P. Banks, who was a lawyer, invited Carl, Harmon, and his wife Pauline to a dinner at his home with the family one night. Carl had dinner with them and had a good time. Pauline didn't talk very much. She seemed to be very sad, which was understandable since she had just lost all 3 of her young children. Carl thought Sheriff Moreland was a good person. One day Moreland took him on a tour of his farm. Carl said, "Harmon, Sheriff Moreland and Deputy Paul Heaton all seemed to be good friends and very close." Carl came back home only one time before the trial, spending a day or 2 heading back to Elizabethton. While in Elizabethton, he went to the jail 5 or 6 times and talked to all 5 of the Bledsoe County men charged with the crime. They were not allowed to talk about the dynamiting or Carl's testimony. A deputy stayed very close to Carl all during these visits and listened to all of their conversations. They knew Carl would be a witness, and Carl said he liked all 5 of the men charged. Sheriff J.M. Moreland lived several miles northeast of Elizabethton along Stony Creek, where he and his family owned a farm and ran a country store. He served as Carter County Sheriff for 5 two-year terms, or a total of 9 or 10 years. He was first elected in 1926 and served until he resigned in March of 1930 for what he said was the best interest of the county. This was after 76 citizens signed a protest against asking for his dismissal. Frank Robinson wrote an article in the Elizabethan Star dated July the 7th, 2006, wherein he stated, Moreland was first elected sheriff in 1928 and had been in office less than a year when a wildcat strike occurred at the local Bimberg plant, resulting in violence, disorder, and a work stoppage. The Tennessee National Guard was called in and placed machine guns on top of the buildings to assist in protecting lives and property during the strike. Moreland was forced to resign the office shortly thereafter as a petition signed by several citizens in the community sought his ouster from office. Moreland was accused of gross inefficiency, of failing and refusing to prosecute persons of high crimes and misdemeanors, of public drunkenness, and the petition also said that Moreland violated state statutes in reference to the disposing of confiscated whiskey. He was also accused of accepting bribes for protection of liquor law violators, to which responded in a paid advertisement this way, Of course, I was cut a little money, for every candidate always is, but my funds went to legitimate causes. In 1932, Moreland again ran for sheriff and won. He was reelected in 34 and 36, but he did not run in 38. Several elderly Carter County residents said many locals called him Cabbage Head Moreland. They said the sheriff received a set allowance for feeding each prisoner. If he could feed them for less money, he could legally pocket the difference. The sheriff raised several acres of cabbage on his farm to feed the prisoners, and it was reported that they had very little else to eat. At one election, Moreland's opposition played the song Boil Them Cabbage Down on loudspeakers on top of his truck and passed out small cabbages to the potential voters to remind them how Moreland fed his prisoners. A widespread joke was told about a prisoner who became ill. When they took the sick prisoner to the hospital, the nurse tested his blood and discovered it contained 50% cabbage juice. Russell Swofford, son of former Bledsoe County Sheriff T.Y. Swofford, was a close friend of White Miller Tollett and all his family. Russell and 8 or 10 other young men from Pikeville drove to Hampton before the trial to visit the 5 men in jail. They traveled in 2 or 3 cars and stayed in May Tollett's boarding house. Nearly all of them had pistols, as was customary for Bledsoe County men during that era. Prior to their departure, they received word that the law was stopping and searching all the cars with Bledsoe County tags in Elizabethton and confiscating all the guns in them or in their cars. Bledsoe County people were welcomed in Carter County like mosquitoes in a nudist colony. In order to avoid the roadblock on their way home, Russell and his friends drove east across the mountains into North Carolina, down through Asheville, and then west to Knoxville on their way back to Pikeville. Russell was quoted as saying, "The Carter County law had it in for anyone from Bledsoe County." A day or 2 before the trial was to begin, a Tennessee Highway Patrol made the trek to Pikeville and picked up William Bell, Wilford McReynolds, Flora Solomon Lester, Evelyn Solomon, and Sheriff Walter Walling, and drove them to Elizabethton to testify in the trial. They went through Dayton. When the Highway Patrol crossed the Bledsoe-Ray County line, he took Walter Walling's pistol away from him and stated, "You're out of your jurisdiction now." Wilford McReynolds and William J. Bell witnessed Church Lester and Crave Tollett testing dynamite on a car exhaust prior to dynamiting Harbin Gouge's car. Wilford was a local man working for William, who was from out of town. They were prospecting for oil in the area of the old gravel pit when the current big gravel pit operator is located on East 30, about 2 miles east of Pikeville. They saw Church and Crave at the gravel pit testing how long it would take to light a fuse attached to a muffler on a car that was fast idling. Church and Crave did not see the 2 men observing them. After the 3 girls were killed, William was in Mrs. Thomas J. Swofford's restaurant in Pikeville. He was drinking, and he told several people in the restaurant what he and Wilford saw several days earlier. Mrs. Swofford overheard them. She called the authorities in Carter County and told them. The authorities came and interviewed both Wilford and William, who told them what they witnessed. Wilford was reluctant to get involved. He said he didn't have anything against Crave, Church, White Miller, Lee, or Ulysses, but he felt he had to tell the truth since William had spilled the beans. A few days before the main trial started on February the 22nd, 1938, Lou Pope, attorney for Sheriff Walling, Myrtle Ferguson, Walter Ferguson, and Johnny Vaughn, argued successfully that their crime, if true, had to be tried in Bledsoe County and not Carter County. Lou Pope was from Pikeville. He had run for governor twice at this time, and he was a special investigator for Governor Gordon Browning. Evidently, Pope was popular statewide because the Johnson City Press stated, "Pope's appearance has been awaited eagerly by the crowd which gathered for the arguments." Judge Allen agreed End of chapter.